Shelley, I would just like to come on from the previous point that was made right at the end of Kate's speech, is actually, during this period of time, we have seen a 37% increase in the value of Lockheed Martin shares. We've seen a 41% increase in the value of Northrop Grumman shares. We've seen 17% increase in the value of Raytheon shares, and 19% increase in shares in General Dynamics. So it seems there are winners in war. In addition to that, ExxonMobil, who was just mentioned, actually in the year of 2022 saw all-time record profits of $56 billion. Shell made $40 billion. Chevron and Total got $36 billion each. And BP, this company that many railed against having any presence in Russia, even within the closing down of its operations, it doubled its profits in that single year of 2022, leaving with $28 billion of profit. This is who has won this period of time. And of course, we can't forget the LNG gas producers of the United States, because of course, as Macron has said very clearly, actually the United States are overcharging people and taking advantage of what has happened, and particularly with the sabotaging of the Nord Stream pipeline. The US has won big with LNG. But there was a key promise made by the US Secretary of State, James Baker, at the time when German reunification took place. The promise was made to Gorbachev that there would not be eastward expansion of NATO. And what has happened since that point? When the Warsaw Pact was dissolved, we saw the idea being floated that really there wasn't any need for NATO anymore. And many point to 2008 being a key period. You look at the Bucharest summit and the statement put out by NATO after it that Ukraine and Georgia will be a part of NATO. But this process certainly didn't begin in 2008. In fact, in 2003, the same year that the US military invaded Iraq, dropping 30,000 bombs in the first month alone, when Halliburton were getting the largest no-bid contract in US history a week before the invasion, the very same month that was happening, you had the foundation of the NATO-Ukraine Civic League. Now this was the establishing of non-governmental organizations across Ukrainian society, over 50, who would proselytize for the benefit of joining NATO. You also had the NATO Information and Documentation Center established in Ukraine, working alongside others in this NATO-funded campaign for what was called an initiative to launch NATO information stands in universities across the country. This is what you call astroturfing a political idea within a society. Now, when we contrast the economic gains that have been made by many in the world, for example, Saudi Arabia going against US diktat on sanctioning Russia, have found themselves in a great position. They have bought Russian oil and then sold it to the rest of the world. They bought it marked down from Russia and bought it marked up to the rest of the world. So the Saudi economy has done very well out of this situation. But what about the Ukrainian economy? Well, in 1 year alone, it shrunk by 35%, despite the tens, hundreds, over $100 billion that have been poured into it. In contrast to the Saudi GDP, which increased by 8.7%, the largest of all, the fastest of all large economies. What we've also seen is 28 countries around the world sending military equipment to Ukraine, and all of those countries, with the exception of Australia, Canada, and the United States, are in Europe. What we've also seen is now the talk of even the supplying of F-15 and F-16 fighter jets. Obviously, there was the mentioning of the depleted uranium, which till this day you have babies being born in Fallujah, in Iraq, with unspeakable suffering due to the use of depleted uranium there. Now, the key thing about a lot of these weapons, as was discovered in Afghanistan with NATO's escapade there, that often the armies which are armed with this equipment, take a very long time to train in order to be able to use it. So what you have established is a laboratory. They've established within Ukraine a laboratory for arms companies where weapons are being tested, and Ukrainians do not even have the training to be able to use many of these weapons. So it's very useful to the military-industrial complex to have this. And so across this period, you have seen 8% of the total housing in Ukraine destroyed or damaged, 50% of the infrastructure directly impacted with regular power cuts, and it is estimated by the IMF that it takes $3 billion a month to prop up the Ukrainian economy. 14 million Ukrainians displaced, 8 million in Europe and 6 million internally. And it is believed that 40% of the Ukrainian population will soon require humanitarian assistance. What we also know is that 60% of the Ukrainian population are now poised to live on less than $5.5 a day, according to the World Bank. But what has the Zelensky government done at the same time as that? Well, it's passed legislation that deprives around 73% of workers of their right to union protection and collective bargaining. And even US government-funded organizations like the Solidarity Center of the AFL-CIO Labour Federation has condemned this as a significant assault on worker rights. And where does Britain fit into all of this? Well, at the very same time that Russia invaded Ukraine, you had the United States spending $3 billion in this country expanding its intelligence and military operations. The very same months. We already have 12,000 US soldiers in this country. On what basis would anyone describe Britain as a sovereign actor? This is not a sovereign state. But interestingly enough, at the same time that the explosions that sabotaged the Nord Stream pipeline took place, the British military was arming Ukraine with underwater drones. The training for the use of those drones was delivered by the British Diving and Threat Exploitation Group and the US Navy Sixth Fleet. Another interesting part of our ecosystem within this country, let's not forget all of the methane that was released by that sabotaging of the Nord Stream pipeline, which, let's be honest, any clear-thinking person would deduce from that it was very, very unlikely to have been Russia sabotaging that whole pipeline. We have an MP in this country by the name of Tobias Ellwood. Now, an important statement he made when rail workers, mail workers, when teachers, when nurses were going on strike. What did Tobias Ellwood say? He said, by doing this, they are being friends of Putin. Who is Tobias Ellwood? Well, simultaneous to being an MP, Tobias Ellwood is a lieutenant colonel in the 77th Brigade. Now that is the British military's psychological warfare brigade. Simultaneous to all of that, he is the chair of the Commons Defence Select Committee, which supposedly gives oversight to the actions of the British Ministry of Defence. This is a mockery. At what basis would you say somebody who is a lieutenant colonel in the psychological warfare brigade of the military is in any position to provide oversight to the Ministry of Defence? And there's no coincidence that Boris Johnson is now jockeying for the Secretary General role at NATO. Boris Johnson did everything he could to scupper a peace deal between Ukraine and Russia. And let's remember that when Keir Starmer gesticulates about the Stop the War coalition, that he himself is part of the Start the War coalition. Yeah. Keir Starmer's record at the CPS, what you see is somebody servile to Eric Holder in the United States, doing everything he can to ingratiate himself to the US. He was a member of the Trilateral Commission alongside figures like George Bush and Jeffrey Epstein, actually. Yeah. But the important thing to remember also about Keir Starmer is that he's funded by Clive Hollick. Who is Clive Hollick? Clive Hollick is the director of Honeywell International, which is an arms company which claims to provide hardware to every single military aircraft in the world. And what about our Defence Minister, Ben Wallace? Well, Ben Wallace doesn't make a big deal out of it, but the same month that he was elected as an MP, he just resigned from being the director of the arms tech company Kinetic. Well, Kinetic lost £20 million in contracts when Britain withdrew from Afghanistan. But what has happened with Kinetic since the war in Ukraine? Well, Kinetic, in a period of 6 months alone in 2022, gained £800 million in new contracts. Now, an interesting fact about Kinetic is one of its directors is on the Defence Advisory Board to Ukraine since 2016, a gentleman by the name of Gordon Messenger, who just so happened to be leading a review into our NHS, into the efficiency of our NHS. And let's not forget that Kinetic has stated that it is interested in getting contracts in the NHS. Our society is defined by conflict of interest. And of course, Kinetic recently let the cat out of the bag when they put a post on their website saying they were working with the Ministry of Defence, developing suicide drones. And they were quickly ordered to take that post down because the Ministry of Defence were not okay with that information being made public. So isn't it interesting that we have a Defence Minister who has this connection to a company which seems to be reaping the benefits of the war in Ukraine? And when we think about NATO, just within our lifetime alone, what did it do in Afghanistan? Well, it caused 5.3 million refugees. It left 72% of Afghans in poverty. And statistically, NATO rendered Afghans the saddest people in the world. And following the withdrawal of NATO from Afghanistan, what happened? Well, the United States froze $9.5 billion worth of assets of the Afghan central bank. And because of that, it is predicted that the poverty rate in Afghanistan will reach 97% in 2022. All of this has come together to lead to a time where the United States has been able to consolidate its power in Europe as never before. But simultaneous to that, it has lost the rest of the world. From the Gulf to Africa to Latin America, US militarism has never been less popular. And in fact, has never been more signified than it is today. It will be seen as one of the biggest mistakes in the history of US imperial domination to push China, India, and Russia into trading with each other in currencies other than the dollar. The process of de-dollarization is going to be felt sharply, not only in the United States, but also in Britain. And the roots of that process obviously precede Ukraine, but Ukraine has greatly, the war in Ukraine has greatly sped up that process. So we must be absolutely clear that when they try to lie to us in our media, the very same people lying to us about Mick Lynch and the RMT are the same people that lied to us about WMD. When they lied to us about rail workers and mail workers, the very same people that lied to us about them are lying to us about Ukraine. And the very same people that tell us that people fleeing these wars in dinghies and dying in the English Channel are our enemies are the very same people lying to us about these war games. Our enemies are not in the English Channel, they're not drowning in dinghies, they are not in the RMT, they are not in the NEU, they are in our government and in the military base.